I was 8 years old when my mother leaned down, her cigarette still burning between her fingers, and told me I was a mistake. Not just any mistake. Her unplanned mistake, like I was some stain on her life she couldn't scrub away. 2 hours later, a social worker with a clipboard came to take me. I remember the sound of the plastic wheels on her suitcase rolling across the cracked sidewalk, the way my backpack felt too heavy for my small shoulders, even though it only carried 2 t-shirts and a toothbrush. They didn't explain much. They just said I'd be better off somewhere else. That somewhere else was a foster home that smelled like bleach and fried food, where kids fought over the good pillow and learned quickly that love wasn't free. I stopped asking when my mom was coming back. I stopped asking if my dad even knew I existed. And in the silence of those nights, staring at the ceiling with someone else's blanket pulled up to my chin, I made myself one promise. If I ever grew up and built a life, it would never look like theirs. It took me 20 years to see them. Again. And when I did, they weren't ready for the woman I had become. By the time I was 12, I had cycled through 4 foster homes. Some were tolerable, most were not. I learned quickly how to keep my head down, how to be invisible, how to make myself useful so I wouldn't be moved on too soon. I washed dishes until my fingers pruned, babysat the younger kids, did homework in corners where no one could trip over me. But no matter how hard I tried, I was always reminded, you don't belong here. You're temporary, don't get too comfortable. Birthdays were a joke, sometimes forgotten, sometimes marked with a generic card signed by a caseworker who barely remembered my name. I would watch other kids get picked up for weekend visits with relatives, their faces glowing with the hope of being wanted, and I would sit on the porch pretending not to care, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. That ache settled in my chest like a permanent bruise. And then, at 14, I figured out what no one had bothered to tell me. My parents lived just 2 towns over. They weren't dead, they weren't missing, they just left me. My mother had remarried. My father had never even tried. They had whole new families, new children, new photos on their walls, pictures that didn't include me. That was the first time I realized I wasn't just forgotten. I was erased. It fueled me every single day. While the other kids slipped through the cracks, I fought my way through school, through part-time jobs, through nights where hunger made my stomach twist. I clung to one idea, that one day I would be standing on my own 2 feet, successful, unbreakable, and they would have no choice but to see me. And when that day finally came 20 years later, when I walked into their lives not as the scared little girl they abandoned, but as a woman with everything they thought I'd never have, the look on their faces was worth every sleepless night. When I turned 18, they handed me a trash bag for my things, signed a form, and said, "Good luck out there." That was the foster system's version of a goodbye party. No guidance, no safety net, no one to call if the lights got shut off, or if the rent came due and I had no money. I walked out of that group home with $72 in my pocket and a determination that felt heavier than any suitcase I'd ever carried. I enrolled in community college because I wanted to prove I wasn't the failure everyone expected me to be. I cleaned offices at night, scrubbing other people's messes until my back ached, then dragged myself to class in the morning with eyes that burned from lack of sleep. Sometimes I would sit in the library and stare at the families that came in together. Kids giggling as their parents read to them, teenagers whining about homework while moms handed them snacks. I would sit there with my used textbooks and stale vending machine crackers, pretending that didn't cut me open inside. But every exam I passed, every paycheck I stretched to cover tuition, every little step forward reminded me I was building something from nothing. By 22, I transferred to a university on a scholarship. I was terrified I wouldn't fit in, surrounded by kids whose parents sent care packages and bought them cars. But I didn't let the fear win. I graduated with honors, not because it was easy, but because I refused to quit. And while I never spoke to my parents, I knew they lived nearby. I even saw my mother once across a grocery store parking lot. She had a little girl with her, holding her hand. For a second I froze, waiting for her to look up and recognize me. She never did. She walked right past, laughing at something her daughter said, and I stood there invisible, holding a sack of rice like it was the only thing tethering me to the ground. That day I swore, one day she will have to look me in the eye. One day she will have to acknowledge me. It just wasn't going to happen on her terms. It would happen on mine. By my mid-20s, life finally started shifting. I landed an entry-level job at a law office, answering phones and making coffee, but I treated it like the opportunity of a lifetime. I showed up early, stayed late, studied every case file I was allowed to touch. My boss noticed. Within a year, I was promoted, and within 3, I had climbed to a position people twice my age were still fighting for. Money stopped being a constant fear. I could pay rent, buy furniture that wasn't from the curb, even book a weekend trip without panicking about my bank balance. And every achievement felt like a brick stacked in a fortress I was building around myself, proof that no one's rejection could define me. I started therapy too, because even as I grew stronger on the outside, inside I was carrying wounds that hadn't healed since I was 8. I admitted out loud, for the first time, that I hated my parents, that I felt worthless, that I sometimes wondered if maybe they had been right, that I was a mistake. Saying it made it real, but it also made me fight harder against it. The therapist asked me what winning would look like. At first I said it was about money, career, success, but the more I thought, the clearer it became. Winning meant they couldn't ignore me anymore. Winning meant I could walk into a room and they would know they had thrown away something valuable. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a community event about overcoming adversity. I stood on that stage, palms sweaty, voice shaking, and told my story. When the applause filled the room, I realized I had power now, the kind they never believed I would have. And then came the invitation that changed everything. A distant relative found me online and reached out. There was going to be a family gathering. My parents would be there. After 20 years, the moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. I almost didn't go. The night before, I sat on my couch staring at the invitation like it was a live wire. What if they looked right through me? What if they laughed, said I was still nothing to them? But then I thought about that 8-year-old girl with a plastic bag of clothes and no one to kiss her goodnight. I owed it to her. So the next morning, I pulled on the sharpest suit I owned, the one that made me feel untouchable, and drove to the event. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way. The gathering was in a rented hall, nothing fancy, but when I walked in, the smell of catered food and the sound of laughter hit me like a wave of déjà vu. Families huddled around tables, kids running between chairs, and at the far end of the room, I saw her. My mother. Her hair was shorter, grayer, but the tilt of her head was the same. Next to her was a man I didn't recognize, and beside him, 2 teenagers scrolling on their phones. My half-siblings, I realized. I froze, watching them, like they were actors in a play I didn't audition for. And then, across the room, my mother's eyes lifted and met mine. For a split second, I thought she might gasp, maybe even cry. Instead, her expression barely flickered. She turned to her husband and said something I couldn't hear, like I was just another stranger who had wandered in. My throat went dry, but I forced myself to move forward, to sign the guest book, to shake hands with relatives who whispered my name with surprise. The whispers spread faster than the music. She's the one they left. That's their daughter? I could feel the weight of 100 unspoken questions. My mother avoided me all night, circling the room like I was contagious. But when the speeches began, and they asked if anyone wanted to share a few words about family, I stood. The microphone felt heavy in my hand. I looked straight at her and said, "Family is supposed to be the people who choose you, not the ones who throw you away." The room went silent. My mother's face turned pale, and in that silence, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mistake. I felt like the truth they could no longer bury. After that night, word traveled faster than I ever expected. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in decades started calling, some curious, some ashamed, some pretending they hadn't known what my parents did to me. But the truth was out, and once, it was spoken aloud in front of all those witnesses. It couldn't be shoved back into the dark. My mother tried damage control. A week later, she sent me a message on Facebook, just one line. "You could have handled that privately." I stared at it for a long time before closing the screen. Privately? She had abandoned me publicly for the whole world to see. She had erased me from her life and paraded her real family around like I never existed. And now she wanted privacy? No, she didn't get that. Soon after, my father's side tried reaching out. He had remarried too, built a new life, one where I wasn't even a footnote. His wife messaged me to say they were sorry for the past, but hoped I wouldn't stir up resentment now. I laughed when I read it. Stir up resentment? They had poured resentment into my veins since I was 8 years old, and now, suddenly, they wanted peace because my existence was inconvenient. But here's what they didn't know. By then, I had built something they couldn't touch. I owned my home. I had savings. I had friends who were closer to me than blood ever was. I had carved a future out of the scraps they left behind, and I wasn't going to let them dictate how I lived it. When I didn't respond to their half-hearted apologies, the rumors started. They called me bitter, ungrateful, even dramatic. I let them talk, because while they whispered behind closed doors, I was already planning the next step, something that would leave no doubt that the girl they threw away had grown into a woman they could never dismiss again. That step came sooner than I expected. A nonprofit organization that supported kids aging out of foster care asked me to share my story publicly. They wanted me to speak at a gala, to donors, press, even local officials. My first instinct was fear. What if my parents showed up? What? If people thought I was just airing dirty laundry? But then I thought of every foster kid I had met who carried the same haunted look I once had, every child waiting for parents who would never come. I agreed. The night of the gala, I walked into a ballroom filled with people in suits and gowns, chandeliers glittering overhead, cameras flashing. My hands trembled as I stepped to the podium, but when I began to speak, the tremor turned into steel. I told them about the night my mother called me a mistake, about the plastic bag they handed me at 18, about the hunger, the invisibility, the endless fight to prove I deserved to exist. I didn't spare details. I let the truth ring out, raw and unpolished, because it wasn't just my story, it was thousands of kids' stories. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. Reporters approached me afterward, wanting quotes. Donors promised more funding. Strangers hugged me, crying, saying they saw their own reflection in my words. And then, as I was leaving, I caught sight of a face I knew too well. My mother. She had come quietly, thinking I wouldn't notice, standing near the back like a shadow. Our eyes locked. For the first time, she didn't look away. Her face crumpled, not with anger, but with something else. Guilt, maybe, or shame. I didn't walk over. I didn't give her the chance to spin excuses. I turned, thanked the organizer, and left through the side door. That was my victory. Not screaming, not demanding an apology, but showing her, showing everyone, that the girl she discarded had built a life so bright she couldn't ignore it anymore. After the gala, everything shifted. My inbox flooded with invitations, podcasts, interviews, conferences. Suddenly, I wasn't just a woman with a painful past. I was a voice people wanted to hear. And with every microphone placed in front of me, I spoke the truth louder. Not for revenge, but for the kids who still thought they were mistakes. The attention caught my parents off guard. They had lived 2 decades pretending I didn't exist, and now strangers were recognizing them in grocery stores, whispering about the daughter they abandoned. My half-sister even reached out, a teenager who had just discovered the truth online. She messaged me late at night. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Mom tell me?" My heart ached reading her words. She didn't deserve the lies she had been fed. We met for coffee, and I told her everything. She cried, hugged me, said she wanted me in her life regardless of what her parents thought. For the first time, I felt like maybe I wasn't alone in this family after all. But the more I rose, the more my mother and father scrambled. They wanted to control the narrative, paint themselves as victims of my bitterness. They sent relatives to smooth things over, to beg me to stop embarrassing the family. I smiled politely and said nothing because my silence spoke louder than their pleas. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into creating a mentorship program for foster youth, funded by the very donations my speeches brought in. Every time I signed paperwork with my name in bold letters, every time I cut a ribbon at a new program launch, I thought back to that little girl dragging her suitcase on a cracked sidewalk. She deserved this. She deserved all of it. And I was going to keep building, no matter how uncomfortable it made the people who had thrown me away. The real turning point came 2 years later when a local magazine ran a cover story on me. The headline read, "From Foster Care to Founder, How One Woman Rewrote Her Story." My photo was plastered across newsstands, online articles, social media feeds. Strangers stopped me in coffee shops saying my story gave them hope. Donations to the nonprofit tripled. And that was when my parents finally broke their silence. They showed up at my office one morning without warning. I'll never forget the look of my receptionist's face when she came in whispering, "There's a couple here who say they're your parents." My heart thudded like a drum, but I told her to let them in. They looked older, smaller somehow. My mother's eyes darted around the polished office walls. My father's hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets like he was searching for excuses he had already rehearsed. They sat across from me, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel like their child. I felt like the one in control. My mother spoke first, her voice brittle. "We just wanted to explain. We were young, overwhelmed. We didn't know what to do." My father added, "You've done well for yourself. We can see that. But dragging the past into the public eye, it's not fair." I let them talk. I let them circle the same tired lines they had probably repeated to themselves for decades. And then I leaned forward and said, what wasn't fair was telling an 8-year-old she was a mistake and leaving her with strangers. What wasn't fair was pretending I didn't exist. What's happening now? This is called consequences. My mother's face crumpled, tears filling her eyes. But I didn't soften. Not anymore. They wanted forgiveness without accountability, peace without truth. I told them calmly that I had nothing left to give them. My life was full, my heart had healed, and I didn't need them to validate me anymore. When they left, my hands were steady, my breath even. The door closed behind them, and for the first time, I felt completely free. They had no more power over me. The little girl who once begged to be seen was gone. In her place stood a woman they could never erase. After that meeting, I thought the chapter was closed, but life has a way of circling back with unexpected tests. A year later, I received a letter from an attorney. My father had passed away, suddenly, and I'd been named in the will. At first, I almost laughed. This was the man who couldn't bother to remember a birthday, who left me to grow up believing I wasn't worth the space I took up. Now, in death, he wanted me to sort through the pieces he left behind. The inheritance wasn't huge, a modest sum of money, some personal belongings, but the weight of it felt heavier than any dollar amount. My half-siblings were listed too, and the letter made it clear. I was legally recognized, no matter how much they had tried to erase me in life. My stepmother called soon after, her voice tight with frustration. She accused me of taking what isn't yours, said I had no right to anything. I let her rant until her words burned out. Then I told her the truth. Everything I've built, I did without a single hand from your husband. I don't need his money, but I won't erase myself from the record to make you more comfortable. I exist, whether you like it or not. I donated most of the inheritance to the nonprofit, turning the money he never gave me into opportunities for kids who needed it more. And when the check cleared, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the ending. My mother tried again after that, showing up at one of my events, lingering at the edge of the crowd. I didn't invite her in, didn't chase her away either. She was just another face in the audience, watching. A woman she once discarded stand tall under the lights. And as I spoke to that crowd, I realized the final truth. My life was never defined by the people who abandoned me. It was defined by the strength I built in their absence. The girl who was once called a mistake had grown into a story worth telling, a life worth living, and a woman impossible to forget. The years that followed became a blur of milestones I never thought I'd reach, expanding the nonprofit into multiple cities, publishing a memoir that hit bestseller lists, even standing on a TED stage with thousands of faces watching me as I told the story I once thought would bury me in shame. Every time I stepped onto a stage, I carried that 8-year-old girl with me, the one clutching a plastic bag and wondering if she was worth anything at all. Now, she stood in the spotlight, not as a mistake, but as proof that survival could turn into something powerful. And yet, in the quiet moments, there were still shadows. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the echo of my mother's voice calling me unwanted ringing in my ears. Sometimes I'd walk past playgrounds and wonder how different my life could have been if someone had fought for me. But the difference now was, those thoughts no longer broke me. They reminded me of the distance I had traveled. My half-sister grew closer with time, visiting me on weekends, sometimes staying over when she couldn't stand the weight of their house anymore. She told me once, tears sliding down her cheeks, "You're more of a mother to me than she ever was." That cracked something open inside me, pain and healing all at once. Because I realized, without ever meaning to, I had become what I needed most, a safe place for someone else. As my life grew, so did the whispers. Old neighbors, family friends, even people from my mother's church reached out, some apologizing for never stepping in, some admitting they'd known all along but stayed silent. At first, I wanted to spit fire, to ask why they had let a child suffer. But instead, I found myself strangely calm. Their silence had shaped me too. It had forced me to be my own advocate, my own rescuer. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood. My revenge wasn't the speeches, or the magazine covers, or even the inheritance I donated in my father's name. My revenge was living fully, thriving openly, refusing to disappear, no matter how many people wished I would. My mother eventually stopped trying to reach me, and that silence became its own closure. She would have to live with the knowledge that the daughter she cast aside had risen higher than she ever imagined. I didn't need her tears, her excuses, or her belated affection. I had carved my own place in the world, and that was enough. And so here I am, 20 years after being left on that cracked sidewalk with nothing but a bag of clothes, standing in a life no one believed I'd ever build. I own the keys to my own home. I run an organization that saves kids from the same darkness I crawled out of, and I carry my story like armor instead of a wound. The funny thing is, people still ask me if I ever forgave my parents. The truth is complicated. Forgiveness for me isn't about letting them back in. It's about letting myself move forward without the weight of their choices tied around my neck. I don't forgive them in the sense of excusing what they did, but I forgive myself for ever believing their words, for ever letting their rejection define me. That's the kind of forgiveness that matters. The last time I saw my mother was at a grocery store, years after everything had already unfolded. She was older, frailer, pushing a cart filled with discounted items. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment I wondered if she would say something. Anything? But she turned away, her shoulders curling inward like someone crushed by the weight of years of silence. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel that ache in my chest when she looked through me. I felt nothing at all, and in that nothing, there was freedom. I walked out into the sunlight, lifted my face to the sky, and realized that the little girl who was once called an unplanned mistake had grown into a woman who created her own destiny. My story wasn't about being abandoned anymore. It was about being found by myself, by the people who chose me, by the life I built brick by brick. And if you're listening, wondering if you'll ever be more than the pain someone handed you, let me be the proof. You can turn their rejection into your power. I am not their mistake. I am my own miracle.